Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan, salam dan salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Thank you for the introduction, and without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let us start our conference today with the first keynote speaker, Professor Geoff Masters. But please allow me to introduce the first keynote speaker for this conference. Professor Geoff Masters, AO, has served as Chief Executive Officer and Board Member of the Australian Council for Educational Research since 1998. He has a PhD from Measurement, Evaluation and Statistical Analysis program at the University of Chicago. In fact, Geoff is my senior from the same graduate program, and the same supervisor, Benjamin Wright. We graduated from the same university, but with different decade, 10 years before me. So it is my great pleasure to be on the same seat with Geoff this morning, here today for this very between quad great conference for assessment, educational assessment, and educational evaluation. Geoff has published widely in the field of educational assessment and research, and we are all well versed in his contribution in the development of psychometric theory, especially in the Rush model. Yet even more, his latest writing outside psychometric area have also become a monumental publication for us as educator, educational researcher, and policymaker. It highlights the need for a unified paradigm or framework of curriculum and assessment. Geoff's contribution to education has been recognized through the award from the Australian College of Educator Medal in 2009 and his appointment as an Order of Australia in 2014. In this first international conference on Assessment and Learning 2022, Geoff will give his keynote address titled Transforming Educational Assessment. So let's invite to come to the stage my senior, Professor Geoff Masters. So now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barul. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me add my own welcome to this conference as CEO of ACER. We're delighted that eventually we're having this conference. We've been planning it for several years, it seems, but the conference is now occurring, and we're delighted to have the keynote speakers we have and to have such distinguished guests with us, including, of course, from the ministry. As you've heard, the topic that I wanted to speak on today, if we can bring it up, is transforming educational assessment. And the main point I wanted to make was that I believe we've reached a point where we need to think differently about educational assessment. I think many of the ways that we've thought about assessment, many of the concepts that we've developed over the decades, we now need to question how useful are they. Even concepts like formative and summative and assessment of learning, assessment for learning and so on, how well are they serving us now? Are they going to be useful ideas into the future? So I really want to question how we currently think about assessment. And I want to situate what I'm going to say today in the broader context of thinking that we're doing internationally, if I can make this move. Sorry, here we go. Situate, now it's going to race forward. Situate what I'm going to say this morning in the context of broader thinking that we are doing internationally about the transformation of school education more generally. And I think there's recognition now that there is a need for serious transformation of school education. And you've already heard this morning of some of the very significant transformations that are occurring here in Indonesia. But there's recognition, I think, globally, that the changes that we now need in school education are not just minor adjustments to what we currently have, but we need to think at a deeper, more fundamental level about how we organise schooling and what changes we need to be making to more effectively meet the needs of young people into the future. And if you can read this, what I'm suggesting here is that there are two imperatives for transformation. The first imperative is to better prepare young people for their futures, for future learning, for future life, for future work, and to ensure that every young person is learning successfully. Every young person is making progress and eventually achieves high standards. And I think what we can see globally is that there are challenges in meeting these two imperatives. It's not clear in school systems around the world that what we're currently providing will always prepare young people for their futures most effectively. And it's certainly clear in school systems around the world that there are many young people who are being left behind in their schooling, who are not achieving minimally adequate levels of achievement, and who are not being well prepared for their futures. So there are large proportions, even in highly developed countries and high-performing countries, there are large proportions of students who are not being well prepared and who are not succeeding at school. And of course, in many developing countries, there's a very large percentage of students often for whom that's true. And what I will be saying this morning is that to address these two imperatives, to better prepare young people for their futures and to ensure that every young person is learning successfully, we really need to be thinking about the whole system, to be thinking about system transformation. It's not just a matter of looking at the curriculum or looking at assessment processes, looking at how we prepare and develop teachers, but actually looking at the entire system, the kinds of support that we provide for young people who need it, what we do to support leaders. So it's a system approach that I'm advocating here. And the diagram that you can see on the screen in front of you, we developed in a study of 5 very high-performing countries internationally, British Columbia, Estonia, Finland, Hong Kong and South Korea. We've just completed a 3-year study looking at those jurisdictions and trying to understand the learning systems, the frameworks that they've put in place to achieve better outcomes for young people. In thinking about why, what I'll be focusing on, of course, especially this morning, is assessment as a component of that broader framework. In thinking about why we need to transform learning systems, it's useful, I think, to reflect for a few minutes on our existing learning systems and to think about the features of existing learning systems. They begin, of course, with the curriculum. The curriculum is developed as a specification of what teachers are expected to teach. The degree of detail varies from one country to another, but the curriculum spells out what teachers are expected to teach and students are expected to learn. The curriculum is organised usually into grade levels or year levels, and the curriculum historically has taken the form of bodies of content that teachers are expected to teach and students are expected to learn. And those bodies of content have often been heavily factual, procedural in their nature. There's been quite a body of material that students have been expected to learn in each year of school. Teaching, of course, is the process of delivering the curriculum. The expectation is that teachers will deliver the curriculum, make it engaging, make it interesting, make sure every student has an opportunity to learn what's specified in the curriculum. The role of students is to learn what teachers teach. We accept that we have accepted in the past that some students are likely to be better learners than others, to be more effective in learning what schools teach, more academically inclined, if you like. The role of assessment in this has been to establish how well students have learnt what they've been taught. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with this. The role of assessment has been to establish how well students have learnt what they've been taught. So very often that leads to a conclusion about how much of the taught content a student has learnt. It might be reported as a mark, a score, a percentage of content that a student has learnt, converted perhaps to a grade, and that is reported, as I say, as a number, as a grade. Now, within that traditional approach to schooling, which we're all familiar with, there are innovations that occur. For example, new topics added to the curriculum, new approaches to assessment, new forms of reporting. An example would be the move that's sometimes made in reporting from simply having A to E grades to trying to describe I'm sorry, this is jumping ahead of me. Trying to describe, here we go, trying to describe the grades or the levels of student achievement. So this is an example from British Columbia, and British Columbia has recently replaced A to E grades with grades that have names: emerging, developing, proficient, extending, and the intention is that in any subject, in any year of school, there'll be a description and an illustration of what it means to be at extending, for example. So extending, like a grade of A, extending doesn't have a general meaning. Extending applies, as I say, to a particular subject at a particular year level, and to understand what extending means, it's necessary to look at the concepts and the competencies appropriate to that year level and to that subject. But the point I'm trying to make here is that while there can be innovations within the traditional approach to schooling, the basic format is still the same. It's still a matter of trying to work out how well students have learnt some body of content, and to communicate how well they've learnt that body of content, either through numbers or grades or interpreted grades of this kind. And most large-scale assessment programs, most tests, most examinations, national and international surveys work within this model that I'm talking about. So they start with a body of content. The curriculum specifies. They look at how well students have mastered that body of content. They sample that content, develop a test with test items that sample that content, and they produce results that really are pretty much the equivalent of grades. And what I have on the screen now are the grades. They don't call them grades, but they're effectively grades. The grades that are used for the reporting of results in PEARLS and TIMS, the IEA studies. And what you can see here is that there are 5 grades: below low, low, immediate, high, and advanced. And in the same way that A to E grades or British Columbia's described grades only have a meaning specific to a particular subject and a particular year level, that's true of these as well. Advanced has no general meaning, It's only possible to talk about advanced in the context of a particular subject at a particular year level. And in the way that the IEA develops these grades, the requirement is that students score above 625 on this scale, and if they score above 625, then they're considered to be working at the advanced level, whether it's Year 4 reading or Year 4 science or Year 8 mathematics. It's always the same rule. So again, the point I'm making here is that even large-scale assessment programs, examinations and tests, and as I say, national and international surveys, tend to work within this traditional model of schooling, this traditional paradigm that is based on bodies of content, the idea that we assess students to see how much of a body of content they've successfully learnt and can reproduce, and then we provide them with grades, and those grades have meanings that are specific to particular subjects and to particular year levels. So what's wrong with that? If you went out onto the street and asked somebody what schools are all about, they're likely to say that schools are about exactly what I just described. There's a curriculum that students are expected to learn, a body of content, often facts and procedures that students need to learn. Teacher's job is to deliver that. Student's job is to learn it. Assessment is to establish how much of that body of content students have learnt, and then they're graded in one way or another. In that process, students start learning, they all start learning that body of content at the same time. They're given the same amount of time to learn that content, and as I say, they're graded and they then move on to the next body of content, usually at the same time in unison. So what do I see as a problem with that? Well, firstly, I see a problem in how well this approach is preparing young people for their futures. Curricula that are heavily focused on bodies of content, particularly that are crowded. Work I did looking at the New South Wales curriculum a few years ago showed just how crowded the curriculum is in that state of Australia, with lots of content that teachers need to teach and get through. What I was being told by teachers was that encouraged passive, reproductive forms of learning at a time when they saw a need to develop deeper understandings, conceptual understandings, skills in applying knowledge, problem-solving skills, skills in working collaboratively, critical thinking, creative thinking, and so traditional ways of organising the school curriculum often don't create time for learning of that kind, and as I say, are often overcrowded with factual and procedural content. So one of the reasons that people are concerned about transforming school systems is exactly that existing systems existing systems do not pay enough attention to the whole student. And this diagram I've taken from a paper that was prepared by Amanda Datnow and her colleagues ahead of the recent UN summit on system transformation. People who talk about transformation often mean different things by the term transformation, but what was very important for Amanda Datnow and her colleagues was that school education was transformed to pay attention to more than traditional subject content, as important as that is, and to pay attention to this broad range of dimensions of development, not just the intellectual, but also emotional and physical and so on. So that's one reason why I think traditional ways of organising schooling and of organising the curriculum and assessment processes needs to be transformed. And as I say, for some people that's the main reason. But for me there's a second very important reason why we need to be thinking about transforming learning systems, and that is that many young people are being left behind by our current arrangements. And that's largely a result of the way that we structure the curriculum. When we require students to learn the same body of content in the same period of time, to move to the next body of content at the same time, what inevitably happens under that traditional model is that some students lack the prerequisites for the next curriculum, for the next body of content, and often fall increasingly behind the longer they're at school. The assumption with each curriculum, each body of content, is that all students will be more or less equally ready for that content, but of course that's not the case. Not all students are equally ready, and as I say, as students are forced to move on with the elapse of time, what tends to happen is that some students, many students often, fall behind in their learning as the curriculum becomes further and further ahead of them. There's been some work done in Australia that makes clear the variability in where students are in their learning. So that's the point I'm making, that existing systems often leave students behind. Let me just explain what I have here. Some researchers, some mathematics education researchers in Australia, Di Seaman and her colleagues, began by describing 8 levels of mathematics achievement. So these are absolute levels of mathematics knowledge and skill. So they looked at these 8 levels, from the lowest level, level 1, to the highest level, level 8. They then assessed national samples of Year 5, Year 6, Year 7, Year 8 and Year 9 students to establish what proportion of students in those samples were performing at levels 1 to 8. And these are the results. What you can see here is that there were some students, a small percentage of students in Year 5 who were already performing at level 8. And there were some students in Year 9 who were still performing at the lowest level, level 1, and everything in between. So at each year level, there were some students at each of the 8 levels. You can see that the average level of achievement increased, as you'd expect it to, from Year 5 to Year 9, but there was enormous overlap in the distributions of student achievement. And what that means is, if we were to try to predict what a student needs in terms of their mathematics learning in a particular year level, and if we were to try to predict that from their year level alone, we would get it seriously wrong for some students. There'd be some students who would be ready for more challenging material, others who were not ready for the material that the curriculum specified. Notice now that these 8 levels, levels 1 to 8, are not tied to particular year levels. They have an absolute meaning. We can talk about level 8 in each of these 5 year levels. We've now broken away from the traditional way of thinking about grades to think about absolute levels of attainment and the progress that students make across these years of school. It's interesting to compare this with results in reading, again using national data from Australia. What we can see here are the distributions of students' reading levels in years 3, 5, 7 and 9 from our national assessment program. You can see again that the average level of reading increases, as you'd expect it to, but again you can also see very significant overlap in these distributions. If you look at the average student, or if you look at the highest achieving students in I can't point to it. Look to the highest achieving students in Year 3, you can see that they are already performing at the average level of a student in Year 7, and there are some students in the bottom right in Year 9, the lowest achieving students in Year 9, who are still performing at the level of the average Year 5 students. So once again, there's very significant variability in students' levels of achievement in each of these year groups. And if you were to try to predict what a student's reading needs were from their year level alone, again, you could get it very seriously wrong. And as with mathematics, the scale on the left now is not specific to a particular year level. 600 on the scale, for example, has a meaning, a general meaning, an absolute meaning that applies across these 4 cohorts of students. And that level of reading can be described and illustrated. So these observations that I've just been making suggest to me that there are some features or some principles that should underpin a transformed learning system. And the first of these is that a learning system and associated assessment processes need to be holistic and integrated. They need to be focused on the development of the whole child, and they need to integrate learning. So it's not just a matter of developing knowledge or developing skills or developing personal attributes, but a holistic approach would involve integrating what I've called here head, hands and heart learning. So part of being holistic is not just paying attention to multiple dimensions of a young person's learning and development, but also doing what we can to integrate those various aspects of their learning. So, for example, the kind of activity that we might get students to engage in is solving problems, and we would use those contexts, those activities, to have students use their domain knowledge and skills to think critically, to think creatively, to collaborate, to use digital technologies. And we might also use those contexts to look at how persistent they are in working to solve a problem, how resilient they are in bouncing back when things don't go as they intend. So a point I want to make here is that assessment processes, as we transform assessment processes need to provide information about a broad range of learning and development, and ideally they will do that by looking at how knowledge and skills and personal attributes can be integrated in meaningful contexts. It's common in assessment, of course, to think that if we're interested in critical thinking, as an example, we need to develop a standalone test of critical thinking, or if we're interested in resilience or persistence, we need to have a standalone test of attributes of that kind. I think the principle of holistic integrated learning suggests to me that the most meaningful and valid way to assess the broad range of competencies and attributes that we're now interested in is to think about how we can gather information about things like critical thinking and persistence, as I say, in meaningful contexts like problem solving that we engage students in. A second feature of a transformed learning system and transformed assessment processes needs to be learner-centred. In education, we often try to infer what students need from the groups to which they belong. And we've certainly done this in Australia. We've observed that students from poorer backgrounds don't do as well as students from wealthier backgrounds. Indigenous students don't perform as well as non-Indigenous students. So what we've concluded is often that we need to develop group-based solutions, to develop programs for poorer students, or programs for boys, or programs for Indigenous students. And what we've seen in Australia is that has not been effective. We have not closed gaps by trying to do that. What I see in high-performing countries is that high-performing countries often try to address issues like poverty by ensuring that every student, for example, has a hot meal every day. Every student has access to free learning resources. Every student has access to high-quality teaching. So the attempt to address concerns is to ensure that every student has access. If there's a concern about the extent to which First Nations students might be disadvantaged by learning in a different cultural environment, then an effort is made to ensure that First Nations perspectives and ways of learning and so on are incorporated into the learning of all students. So rather than attempting to infer students' needs from the group to which they belong, and the example I put up here again is year groups, rather than attempting to infer students' needs from the group to which they belong, we need to be thinking about learners as individuals, seeing them as having unique needs and doing what we can to develop more learner-centred approaches that involve, firstly, as I say, understanding individual needs, drilling down, perhaps in a more diagnostic sense, trying to understand where individuals are and what their needs are, thinking about how we communicate where they are, not in terms of grades, but in terms of where they are in their learning, on a roadmap of learning and development. And this leads to my third, so assessment processes need to provide information about where individuals are in their learning. And then the third feature of a transformed learning system is that it needs to be growth-oriented. And by that I mean that all components of the learning system need to be based on an understanding of learning as ongoing, as cumulative, as potentially lifelong. So learning is not just a matter of mastering a body of specified content, but learning is undertaken for the purposes of long-term growth. And as we move away from curricula that have been almost exclusively in the past based on bodies of discipline content, to incorporate into the curricula things like critical thinking and creative thinking and collaborating and using technology and attributes like resilience and growth mindset, it becomes even more obvious that we need a growth orientation. You don't teach critical thinking in a particular year of school. Critical thinking is something that is long-term, ongoing, throughout the years of school, beyond school as well. So as we move towards this broader range of competencies and attributes, personal attributes, it becomes increasingly obvious that we have to adopt growth-oriented approaches to learning, and that these things like resilience and so on develop over extended periods of time. Even deep conceptual understanding develops over an extended period of time, often across the entire years of school. But there's another reason for thinking about a growth orientation, and that comes back to what I was saying earlier about the way that we structure learning in schools currently, requiring students to address a body of content, be graded on that body of content, and then move on to the next body of content at the same time. As I said earlier, under that traditional model of schooling, we make the assumption that students are more or less equally ready to learn the body of content that we're about to teach. But as you can see from the graphs that I showed you, at the beginning of a school year, it's not the case that all students start at the same point. If school were a running race, it's not the case that everybody commences the school year on the same starting line. In fact, students are widely spread out on the running track by the equivalent of up to 7 years of learning. And yet, what we tend to do under the traditional model is to assess everybody against the same finish line, against the expectations for their year level. And as I said, the consequence of that is that some students fall increasingly far behind as they lack the prerequisites and the curriculum gets further ahead of them. And we also end up not helping students see the progress they're making. We give them a D this year, a D next year, a D the year after, effectively hiding from them, disguising the absolute progress they're making, and potentially sending a message to them that there's something stable about their ability to learn. That is, they're, in that case, a D student. So a growth-oriented approach would help students see the progress they're making, and in that way build their self-efficacy as learners, build their self-concept as being able to learn successfully if they're provided with learning opportunities at an appropriate level, and if they're given time, because the other thing about the traditional way of organising schooling is it is very heavily time-based. Students are required to move on to the next curriculum, whether they're ready or not. And then finally, a reason for thinking about a growth orientation is that snapshots of where students are at particular points aren't very effective in helping us think about the progress that they're making, or how they got to be where they are. So for example, if we assess students at 15 years of age and we want to improve performance at 15 years of age, waiting until 15 years of age is leaving it too late. We need to be thinking about the progress that students are making in areas like reading and mathematics in the years leading up to 15 years of age. And some school systems internationally are now working on that. Places like Estonia are thinking about how they can redesign their national assessment programs to better monitor the progress that students are making in the years leading up to 15 years of age, and putting snapshots in the context of long-term growth. And another reason for doing this is that if we have measures of growth, we have a better opportunity to evaluate the impact that educational policies and initiatives are having. It's very difficult currently, extremely difficult, to look at how students are performing at, say, 15 years of age and to draw meaningful inferences about the effectiveness of the school system that they've been engaged in up until that point. As an example, students in South Korea do extremely well by international standards, but to what extent is that a reflection of the quality of the education that's been provided in South Korea, and to what extent is it a reflection of parental expectations, cultural pressures, the role of Hagwons, their tutoring, outside school tutoring system. It's very hard to answer questions of that kind, to untangle the influences on student achievement. But if we had information about the value add, information about the growth that occurs over time, say between 13 and 15 years of age, we'd have a better basis for thinking about the influence that the school system itself was having on student learning. We'd be able to say, in a particular school system, what's the average level of growth that occurs between 13 and 15? Is that different from in another country? If so, can we understand that difference? How many 13-year-olds in a country are already performing above the level of the average 15-year-old? Can we think now about the progress that occurs, or the variability that occurs in terms of years of growth? at 15 years of age, what's the difference between the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile in terms of typical average growth? Is it 4 years of school? Is it 5 years of school? So there'd be a whole set of questions that could be asked if we had better measures of the growth that occurs rather than focusing just on single snapshots of learning at particular points in time. So the point that I'm making here, the final point that I'm making, is that assessment processes need to be transformed to provide information about the growth that students make over time. And that's, as I say, very important for individual learners to help them see the growth that they're making, appreciate that they're being successful in their learning, and can see, as I say, how they're going. But it's also important at a national level for thinking about growth that occurs across the years of school. So the final point is, in conclusion, in our attempts to transform school education, it's very important that we focus on the whole system, on the whole framework within which schools are operating, not just focus on how we prepare teachers, not just focus on the curriculum, but to think about the whole system, to think about how we underpin the transformation of that learning system by a set of principles, and I'm suggesting here that some principles would be holistic, integrated, student-centred and growth-oriented, and the assessment processes then have to be transformed and thought of as part of that transformation that we're trying to achieve throughout the whole learning system. Terima kasih.
Yeah, thank you, Geoff. I think we just learned a very important point. Thanks, Geoff, for sharing key pieces of between what learning transformation and at the same time assessment transformation. And we have a very limited time, probably not more than 10 minutes. So let's us begin with a Q&A session, and probably I'll take 1 or 2 questions, but at most 3 questions probably. From right side, is there anybody want to? It's a good opportunity for you to share this forum. Yeah. Yeah, on the left. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tia. I'm a high school teacher at the Amika school here in Bali. Thank you so much for the points. My question is because in the classroom, I often find that, these are really great ideas, but I also often find that I'm fighting against the currents of school demands and curriculum demands. And I suppose my question is, these ideas of the growth-oriented, holistic, and learner-centered assessment, does it require a complete overhaul of the school system, or is it possible to incorporate that as a classroom teacher? Are there some examples of how these ideas can be incorporated while at the same time still balancing that with demands of the school and expectations? Because oftentimes, like, I want to implement some of these ideas, but then at the same time, okay, we have to focus on preparing students for assessments and for tests, for their exams. And so yeah, I think it would be great to get some insight on some examples, perhaps, on how these ideas could be incorporated practically. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And I think it is extremely difficult for teachers to incorporate these ideas into their teaching if they are under significant pressure currently. So I referred to work that I did in New South Wales reviewing the curriculum for the state of New South Wales for the government there. And what teachers often said to me was, yes, we value critical thinking, we value collaborating, we value what you're saying about the need to differentiate, to think in terms of the progress or the growth that students are making, but you need to understand that there are lots of administrative requirements now. So I spend a lot of my time doing paperwork and other administrative things, and also the curriculum is extremely crowded. There are lots of dot points, they told me in New South Wales, lots of dot points in the curriculum that I need to get through. And often they would say to me that they are racing to get through those dot points, and they were concerned that that was leading them to teach in more superficial ways, preventing them from teaching in depth. They'd also sometimes say something that I think is quite interesting. Some of them said to me, I don't have time for these general competencies because I'm too busy covering the curriculum. So they actually didn't think of things like the ones I mentioned, using technologies and collaborating and critical thinking and so on. They actually didn't think of that as part of the curriculum. The curriculum for them was the set of content, the body of content, the dot points that they needed to get through. So to answer your question, yes, I think it does need, in many cases, very significant transformation, often a reduction in the volume. As important as facts and routines are, we need to think about how essential it is that students are memorising big volumes of content, and how we can get them more focused on developing deep conceptual understandings, and that means time. We need to create time for teachers to do that. But if you simply say to teachers, cover everything that's there, do the administrative tasks, and by the way, differentiate and focus on the growth that students are making, they'll tell you they can't do that.
Yeah, okay. Let's take one more question from the floor, probably at the middle or right side. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for your presentation. I think it is a wonderful presentation, wonderful event. And I would like to know how to improve the quality of teaching and learning process. Nowadays, we have national assessment, and we have school report card in the school. And nowadays, the school follow up the data like teacher performance, student performance, literacy, and numeracy. And in one hand, the majority of school, of teacher or principal, aware about this. On the other hand, the school lack of the commitment about this. So how can improve the quality of the school? How can improve the spirit of the principal, teacher to follow up this data to improve the quality in teaching and learning, and the aim to improve the quality student performance? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I understand your question. Ask it again if I don't. For me, what's really important when we talk about assessment is that the assessments are used to help teachers understand where individual students are in their learning. And they can do that through their classroom assessments. And ideally, if there are national assessments, the national assessments would also be providing them with helpful information about where their students are in their learning. This is not always the case. Often assessment programs are used for accountability purposes, to pay performance pay to teachers or school leaders. But for me, the really important thing is that there is quality information that teachers can use, as I say, to understand where individual students are and to think about what the best next steps are, the starting points for further teaching and learning.
Yeah. So, thank you with the answer from Geoff. It is also we have to conclude our session, the first keynote session, and I'm very sorry for the time constraint. And thanks again, Geoff, for your time and your sharing of your ideas of transforming learning and also transforming the assessment system. Again, give big applause to Geoff, and thank you, Geoff, and thank you also to all of you, and thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.